Story 1. Growing up, my mom gave me this small jewelry box with cushioned slots for rings. I was pretty particular about my belongings at 13, and I had 6 cheap rings, mood rings and silver bands mostly, that I kept arranged in a specific order. It wasn't valuable stuff, but it was mine, and I knew exactly how I wanted it. One afternoon, after spending hours getting my room exactly how I wanted it, I noticed something was off about my jewelry box. 2 of the rings were in different positions than where I'd left them. I knew immediately somebody had been going through my things. When I confronted my family, everyone denied touching the box. My parents tried to reassure me that I must have moved them myself and forgotten, but I knew better. The more they insisted no one had touched it, the more unsettled I felt. My dad could tell how bothered I was by the whole thing. Instead of just dismissing my concerns, he decided to do a thorough check of the house. Room by room, he went through everything, checking for anything else that might be out of place. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. Our laptops were still there. The TV was untouched. My mom's diamond earrings were right where they should be. But then my dad checked the medicine cabinet. An old bottle of hydrocodone from his dental surgery was missing. My mom decided to check her bathroom drawer, where she kept some of her less expensive jewelry. Several gold chains and bracelets were gone. The drawer itself had been arranged to look untouched. Everything lined up perfectly, just missing a few select pieces that weren't immediately noticeable. The police officer who came to take the report told us there had been a string of similar break-ins throughout our neighborhood. The pattern was always the same. No signs of forced entry, no damage to windows or doors. The thieves were selective, taking only prescription medications and small gold items that could be easily pocketed and sold. They left behind electronics, expensive jewelry, and other valuable items that might be traceable. As the officer took notes, more disturbing details emerged. In each house, small things had been moved, just enough to suggest someone had methodically gone through every room. A chair slightly out of position, a drawer closed not quite all the way, a window blind tilted at a different angle. The thieves were careful, but they couldn't help leaving tiny traces of their presence. The investigation revealed something even more unsettling. The break-ins weren't random. The thieves had been watching our neighborhood, learning our routines. They knew when people left for work, when kids went to school, even which families had regular appointments or activities that left their homes empty at predictable times. In our case, they'd noticed my mom's Wednesday tennis lessons, my dad's late nights at the office, and my after-school band practice. They'd figured out exactly when our house would be empty and for how long. They'd probably been inside multiple times, taking their time to search thoroughly, knowing exactly how long they had before someone returned. The officer showed us marks we hadn't noticed before. Tiny scratches around our door locks, worn spots on windowsills, slight scuff marks on the floor near entry points. Professional tools had been used to bypass our security measures so smoothly that nothing looked forced or damaged. These weren't opportunistic thieves. They were methodical professionals who treated breaking into homes like a regular job. More neighbors started coming forward as they checked their homes more carefully. One found prescription labels in their trash, from bottles they thought they'd thrown away months ago. The thieves had been replacing medications with over-the-counter pills. Another discovered their home security camera had been tilted slightly upward, just enough to miss the front door. Someone else realized their spare key was missing from its hiding spot, explaining how the thieves returned so easily. What made it worse was learning how they operated. They would enter homes during broad daylight, dressed like maintenance workers or delivery people. If confronted, they had convincing stories ready. They kept detailed notes about each house, what to take, where to look, which items would be missed and which wouldn't. They knew more about our daily lives than any stranger should. The police never caught them. The robberies continued for another month before suddenly stopping. They estimated the thieves had hit at least 20 houses in our area, but those were just the ones where people noticed something was missing. Given how careful they were, there were probably many more victims who never realized their homes had been violated. Story 2. I travel 4 days a week for work, leaving my wife Sarah and our daughter Emma alone in our 2-story colonial. The strange occurrences started so gradually that I initially dismissed Sarah's concerns as anxiety. Now I know better. It began with Sarah's texts about moved furniture, a dining room chair pulled out 6 inches from the table, the living room ottoman rotated 45 degrees, the kitchen stools rearranged. I suggested she was noticing normal variations more because I was away, but she started taking photos to document the changes. The first time I witnessed something myself, I was home for a weekend. I distinctly remembered leaving my laptop on the kitchen counter Friday night, but Saturday morning it sat perfectly centered on the coffee table. Sarah insisted she hadn't touched it. Emma was at a sleepover. Our grocery expenses increased by $200 that month. Sarah kept detailed lists, counting items before and after my trips. 6 granola bars would become 4. A full gallon of milk would be half empty 2 days later. A new box of cereal would be mysteriously depleted. We blamed Emma at first, but she became upset at the accusation, insisting she always wrote down what she ate on the whiteboard. The utility bills spiked next. Our electricity usage doubled, then tripled, especially during daytime hours when the house should have been empty. The gas bill showed constant heating cycling, even on mild days. When I called the utility company, they suggested our HVAC system needed maintenance. I hired an HVAC specialist. He found nothing wrong with our system but noted unusual wear patterns on the air filters, as if they were being used far more than our typical usage would suggest. He also pointed out some dark smudges around the vents that looked like fingerprints. The financial irregularities started small. $20 missing from my wallet, $30 from Sarah's purse. Emma's birthday money disappeared from her desk drawer, leading to a huge argument when Sarah and I thought she'd spent it without permission. 3 days later, we found the empty envelope tucked behind her dresser. During one of my rare weeks working from home, I noticed small sounds throughout the day. Creaks from the ceiling, scratching in the walls, the distinct sound of footsteps when everyone else was accounted for. Our cat started sleeping in Emma's room exclusively, hissing at the attic access panel whenever she passed it. Sarah convinced me to have our pastor bless the house. During the blessing, we all heard a loud thud upstairs. The pastor and I searched every room but found nothing. That night, I discovered my spare change jar had been reorganized. All quarters removed, replaced with equal value in dimes and nickels. The shower became a point of contention. I'd wake up to wet towels and puddles on the bathroom floor, but Sarah swore she hadn't showered yet. Emma insisted she only showered at night. The bathroom mirror would fog up around noon on weekdays when no one should have been home. Our neighbors rang our doorbell one morning to return Sarah's diamond earrings. They'd found them in their garden, along with a few other pieces of her jewelry we hadn't even realized were missing. The next day, I found boot prints in the upstairs hallway carpet that started at the attic access and disappeared halfway to the stairs. Everything came to a head when Emma stayed home sick from school. Sarah had a crucial meeting she couldn't miss, so I worked from home to watch Emma. Around noon, I headed upstairs to check on her. I heard male voices coming from the kitchen. Thinking we had a break-in, I crept downstairs with my phone ready to call 911. A gaunt man in filthy clothes stood at our open refrigerator, eating leftover lasagna straight from the container. Another man sat at our kitchen table, scrolling through a phone I recognized as Sarah's old one that had gone missing weeks ago. They froze when they saw me. I froze too, suddenly understanding all the small disparities of the past 4 months. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering on the hardwood floor. The sound broke our mutual paralysis. The man at the refrigerator dropped the lasagna container, splashing red sauce across our cream-colored tiles. The second man bolted up so fast he knocked over the kitchen chair. I backed away toward the stairs, my mind racing to Emma's bedroom upstairs. The refrigerator man lunged forward, but his sock-clad feet slipped in the spilled sauce. He went down hard, cracking his head against the kitchen island. The other man vaulted over our counter and sprinted for the back door. I heard it slam as I ran upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. Emma was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed at the commotion. I locked her door, called 911, and watched through her window as the second man disappeared over our back fence. The police found evidence of long-term habitation in our attic. The men had created separate sleeping areas, complete with stolen blankets and pillows from our linen closet. They had a notebook documenting our family's schedules, including my detailed travel itinerary. They'd been timing their movements around our routines, living in our house like parasites, wearing paths through our lives we tried to explain away. Story 3. It was the winter break when I was 17, and I stayed alone at our isolated family farm for several weekdays in a row. My dad and brother only came on weekends due to work, so from Monday to Friday I was by myself. The nearby houses were mostly abandoned. The village was quiet, and deep snow covered the woods. I remember it being around 3 in the morning. The farm sat on the edge of thick forest land, and the wind carried new snow over a layer of frozen crust. Earlier that evening, I had tended to the smoker shed next to the house, where we dried meat and stored logs for the fireplace. The smoker shed, a small structure separate from the main home, also had a pizza oven, and I used it to keep some meat curing during the day. I needed more firewood for the furnace inside and wanted to ensure the smoker's fire was fully out before I slept. I stepped outside, feeling the cold bite into my cheeks. The snow had fallen for days, and the first layer was icy enough to make a crackling sound when new flakes landed. It sounded like sugar grains pouring over a hard surface. As I walked toward the shed, I paused and just listened. The sound was oddly soothing, a quiet hiss as tiny crystals skimmed the frozen top layer. Under the porch light, I could see the flakes drifting at an angle, caught by gusts from the woods. No animal tracks, no distant headlights, just the creaking of an old fence and that soft sound of snow meeting ice. Inside the shed, the faint smell of smoke and cured meat lingered. I checked the smoker carefully, touching the outside surface with my glove to confirm it was no longer warm. The fire was out, just ash and a bit of charred wood left. I grabbed an armful of logs stacked near the pizza oven. Everything felt routine until I stepped back outside. The wind had intensified slightly and I tightened my jacket, making my way toward the house. Once inside, I placed the firewood next to the furnace and decided to quickly empty the ashes before bed. I walked onto the porch with a metal bucket of ash, intending to dump it into the bin we kept outside. I stood at the edge, about to empty it, when I noticed something strange. A moment before, the night had been filled with that faint hiss of snow on ice, the distant hum of wind in the trees, maybe even the muffled rustle of old branches. Now there was only silence, complete and utter silence. My heart seemed to slow, and I lifted my head, scanning the darkness. The snow was still falling, I could see that clearly, but I heard nothing. No crunch, no hiss, no wind, just a void of sound. I froze, gripping the ash bucket's handle tightly. Something about that silence felt unnatural, as if the world had paused. I turned my head slowly, feeling the hair on my neck rise. Then I heard a faint melody, like a distant lullaby sung by a woman's voice. It was gentle, almost comforting, yet it had no place here in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. I could not pinpoint the direction. It seemed to echo both from the woods and around the house. There were no visible figures, no movement beyond the falling snow, yet that quiet singing drifted through the silence. I stood there, not daring to step off the porch. My chest tightened. No one lived close enough to be wandering near our property at that hour. Certainly not in heavy snowfall and not singing lullabies. I tried to catch any sign of a person, a silhouette near the tree line, a lantern's glow, but saw nothing. Just darkness and white flakes swirling. The melody continued, soft and steady. It sounded like someone trying to soothe a child to sleep, the kind of tune you might hum in a nursery. My throat felt dry, and my legs trembled slightly. After a few moments of standing there, I could not take it anymore. I hurried inside, bolted the door, and headed straight to my bedroom. There I locked myself in, pressed my ear to the door, and listened. Nothing. The lullaby had stopped the instant I retreated inside. The silence returned, broken only by my own breathing. I paced the room, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but I knew what I heard. I stayed awake until morning, my nerves frayed. At first light, the world outside looked normal. Fresh snow covering old footprints, pale sunlight filtering through branches. No signs of anyone lurking around. My dad arrived a few days later for the weekend. I told him what happened, how I heard a lullaby in the silence. He seemed skeptical, just shrugged and said, maybe I was tired and jumpy from being alone too long. He suggested we leave early and go back home the next Monday, and I agreed. I never spent another full stretch of days alone on that farm again. It was only months later that I learned what had occurred that winter. Our farm was near a small village mainly inhabited by elderly folk, some living alone with no family to notice if they disappeared. That year, an old woman had gone missing during a heavy snowfall. No one reported it right away, since she had no close relatives or friends. She lived in a small house on the far side of the forest, had no electricity, and must have needed help. She likely tried to walk through the woods toward our house, perhaps seeing our lights and recalling that my great-grandmother had once served as a village healer. The old woman never made it. They found her body a few months later, about 2 miles into the forest, stuck in a dry river basin. The assumption was that she suffered a stroke or became incapacitated somehow, unable to call out for help, perhaps only able to produce strange sounds. Remembering that eerie lullaby, I wondered if those sounds were her voice carrying over the silent snow. Story 4. I was 8 and spending a long holiday in Surat, a small country town in Queensland, staying with relatives. They put me in their son's old bedroom since he had moved away for university. Everything felt strange and new, especially at night. The room had high ceilings and old-fashioned tiles that shifted slightly if pressed. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd never slept in a place like this before. It smelled faintly of dust and old clothes, and the window overlooked a quiet backyard with scraggly grass and a leaning fence. During the day, I felt safe enough, playing with my cousins, helping pick fruit from a small orchard behind the house, and listening to my aunt's stories about how quiet the area got after dark. At night, though, I kept having the same horrible dream, an alien tentacle reaching down, trying to snatch me off the bed. After a few nights, I started dreading bedtime. My parents told me I was just unsettled because we were away from home, that nothing bad would happen. Still, I lay awake, staring at the old clock on the dresser, watching its hands creep forward. Around 2 in the morning, I would wake up shaking, sure I'd heard something scrape overhead. Some nights, I thought I saw a subtle shift in the ceiling tile above the bed, a tiny corner lifting as if nudged from above. Whenever that happened, I pulled the blankets tight, too afraid to move or call out. As the days went by, my fear grew. I told my dad about my dreams, how I kept seeing a creature with a wet, glistening tentacle. He sighed and checked the room's ceiling quickly, tapping the tiles, saying they were probably just loose. My aunt said maybe possums got in the roof sometimes. That didn't comfort me. The idea of animals crawling around above me at night felt just as bad. I heard strange noises at odd hours, a faint rustling, a gentle thump, as if something heavy was shifting in the rafters. One evening after everyone had gone to sleep, I tried to calm myself by reading a comic book I'd brought from home. The dim lamp cast long shadows across the floor, and every time I glanced up at the ceiling, I held my breath. The hours dragged. Just after midnight, I thought I caught a faint hiss from somewhere above. My heart hammered, and I whispered to myself that I was being silly, that it was just the wind in the trees outside. But no trees were that close. The nightmares kept recurring, a dark shape above me, lowering a tentacle. Except it never touched me in the dream. It just hovered, waiting. I started sleeping with a flashlight clutched in my hand. At 2 in the morning, I would flick it on and point it at the ceiling, half expecting to see something dangling there. Night after night, I saw nothing except the tile, slightly askew. By morning, I felt foolish, but as evening approached, dread would settle in my stomach again. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. I overheard my uncle telling my parents that I needed to relax, that maybe I was reading too many scary books or staying up too late. They suggested I sleep with the door open, let some hallway light in, but that didn't help. Every night, around the same time, I would lie there waiting, petrified by the thought of that alien arm. The sound of the old ceiling fan rattling did nothing to soothe me. I strained my ears for any hint of movement above. On the 7th night, I couldn't even close my eyes. The clock on the dresser showed 1:45 a.m. I counted the minutes, praying for sunrise, wishing I were back in my own room at home. The world outside was silent, no cars, no distant voices. Just after 2 a.m., I heard a soft scraping noise. My chest tightened and I stared at the tile. Then it moved, a slight wobble, and before I could react, something heavy and muscular flopped onto the bed. I screamed. I felt a weight pressing the mattress down. In the darkness, I could make out a shape wriggling near my feet. It was not slimy or wet, but it moved in a serpentine way, twisting and looping. I leapt out of the bed, screaming at the top of my lungs. My flashlight fell to the floor, rolling under the dresser. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. I backed into a corner, still screaming, tears rolling down my face. My parents and relatives rushed in, flipping on the overhead light. I could barely speak, just pointed at the bed, my voice caught in my throat. Everyone crowded around, shocked into silence. Lying there, stretched out across the rumpled sheets, was a massive carpet python, over 2 meters long. It lifted its head slowly, tongue flicking the air. My aunt gasped. My dad swore under his breath. My sister clung to the doorframe, eyes wide. No alien tentacle, no monster from outer space. Just a snake, huge and calm, having slipped through a loose ceiling tile. Each night it must have tested that spot, waiting for a moment to come down. Maybe it was attracted by warmth or some scent. The snake began to slide toward the edge of the bed, searching for a way down. My uncle hurried to open the window. Using a broom handle, my dad carefully guided the python away from me, pushing it toward the sill. Eventually, the snake slithered out, disappearing into the dark yard. In the daylight, everyone tried to laugh it off, but I knew what I'd seen and how close it had come. The memory of that heavy body landing on the bed remained, more vivid than any nightmare. Story 5. When I started college, a group of my friends and I would often hang out at my friend Sean's dad's place in the countryside. It was a comfortable spot, far from the city lights, and we could see stars stretching clear across the sky. At night, we often spotted a radio tower in the distance, maybe a few miles out, blinking faintly through the darkness. The house was old and sat down a dirt road, well off any main highway. We would head there on weekends, piling into a car after classes ended and driving out late. Sometimes we played music, sometimes we just sat around the porch in silence, looking at the farmland and the dim outlines of distant fences. There was no traffic out here, just a scattering of country homes and abandoned barns. Sean's dad would be asleep, working odd hours, leaving us to our own devices in the open yard. One late fall night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, we were bored and restless. The air felt colder than usual, and the fields looked emptier. No one else seemed awake for miles, and the quiet felt heavy. That was when my friend Brian mentioned the radio tower again, the one we had seen many times before. We started talking about what was out there. Maybe it was just a normal structure. Maybe it had some kind of maintenance shed. We were young and curious, and the empty fields around us felt like invitations to explore. Sean, who had the car keys, shrugged and said we could check it out. It seemed like a harmless idea. Drive toward the tower, see what it looked like up close, then come back. We set off down a dirt lane, the headlights carving tunnels through the darkness. After a while, we turned onto a narrower path that led toward where we believed the tower stood. The land was flat, and eventually we passed through a low gate that sat open, its chain hanging loose. No signs indicated private property or restrictions, and in our youthful confidence, we assumed we could enter without any trouble. We drove slowly, maybe a quarter mile into that big empty field. Sure enough, the tower rose up ahead, a tall, skeletal structure with red lights that blinked at intervals. Closer now, we realized it was older than we expected, with rusty sections visible under the faint moonlight. Beneath it, we spotted something else, a beaten-up old car with chipped paint and missing hubcaps. It sat at an odd angle, nose slightly down, as if stuck in a shallow depression in the ground. The car looked abandoned, covered in dust and grime. We pulled around the opposite side of the tower, parked a short distance away, and left the engine running low. The radio played softly and we talked quietly, wondering who might have left that wrecked car out here. There were no houses in sight, just the empty field and a few distant silhouettes of trees. I remember leaning forward in my seat, squinting through the windshield. The atmosphere felt off, as if we had stumbled into a place we were not meant to be. The tower blinked overhead, and the night air slipped in through the cracked windows. Then Brian spoke up. "Does it look like there is a light in that car?" We all turned our attention toward the old vehicle. Through the dusty windows, we saw a faint glow, not bright like headlights, but more like a weak lantern or a phone screen. It flickered slightly as if someone were moving inside. Immediately, the mood in our car changed. None of us had seen anyone come or go, and if somebody was inside that junk car, we wanted no part of it. Sean put the car into drive and started rolling forward, turning slowly to head back the way we came. We moved at a crawl over the uneven ground. Suddenly, Brian said, "That car is following us." I looked back and saw that the old car had indeed begun rolling along behind us. It had no headlights on, yet the interior glow brightened, giving the impression of movement inside. Our pulse rates shot up. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. None of us said anything for a moment. Then Sean whispered something, cursed under his breath, and pressed harder on the gas. We bumped along the field, throwing up dirt and bits of grass. Our tires slipped a little, but we gained speed. Behind us, the battered car kept coming, its outline blurred in the dust, but we could see that glow inside getting stronger. No one rolled down a window. No one called out. We just kept going. For a second, I thought I saw a figure behind the dirty windshield, but the angle and dust made it hard to tell. Sean shouted, "Screw this!" and floored it, the engine whining as we tore back toward the open gate. The rough terrain bounced us around in our seats. Eventually, we cleared the field's entrance, turned sharply onto the dirt road, and kicked up a cloud so thick it hid everything behind us. When we glanced back, the car was nowhere to be seen. We did not slow down until we reached the main rural road. We drove straight back to Sean's dad's house, locked the car, and went inside without a word. None of us slept much that night. We kept imagining that glow, that silent pursuit. In the morning, the sunlight made it all feel distant and unreal. We joked about it and called it the ghost car story, a label that felt safer than the truth. We never believed in ghosts, not really, but the idea of a normal explanation seemed worse. We preferred a harmless superstition to facing what might have actually gone on in that field. A few years later, we found out that the local sheriff's office had been monitoring that same farmland for large drug deals. They had recorded suspicious activity near the radio tower, where buyers and sellers met under cover of darkness. The old car might have belonged to someone expecting a deal that night, or maybe it was a scout keeping watch. Had we lingered, we might have been in serious danger. That field turned out to be a hotspot for crime. We were lucky to have left when we did. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.